I better record this. So today is 122. What we want to talk about now is going beyond evaporation and precipitation. So how do living things play a part in this? So we have two living things here. One is an autotroph. One's a heterotroph. Yes?
Yep.
Which one's the autotroph?
The tree.
The tree. Okay. So
The wabbit.
the wabbit is not an autotroph. So we have an autotroph and a heterotroph. That autotroph is taking water in through its roots, through some structure of its body, and they all do it differently. Trees absorb most of their water through their roots. And it is actually putting out a significant amount of water back into the atmosphere through that process that was named in the sheet you just worked on called transpiration. And an average sized tree puts out, I forget what it is, like 80 gallons of water a day into the atmosphere. Like, it pulls it up through the roots. I mean, I'll have to look up the figure to get an exact number, because I may not be remembering that correctly. But it's a number that I remember going, whoa, that's not possible. It is an astounding amount of water. And this is not liquid water, this is water vapor. They're putting water vapor out into the environment. For that reason, having trees around your home is equivalent to having like an air conditioner. Because as that water hits the atmosphere, not only do you have shade, as that water hits the atmosphere and evaporates, it cools. It has cooling properties. Okay, so trees put it back out into the atmosphere through transpiration. So heterotrophs and autotrophs both produce some water as part of their cellular processes. Heterotrophs don't have as direct a way to put water back into the environment, but you all do breathe out water vapor. You know that. If you go on a cold morning and go, you can see your breath. It's because the water vapor in your breath is condensing. So heterotrophs also put water back out into the environment. It's a much smaller, notice how tiny that line is? I should make it even smaller. It's a tiny little amount, okay? But they do, it's less important. Their cellular respiratory processes produce some water as waste, and they breathe out some of that as vapor. Really the big part I want you to know, remember, we're skimming the surface on this, is that autotrophs are huge in terms of the water cycle. That transpiration is a big deal. It's putting out a bunch of water back into the atmosphere. And they're using it for their processes. That's really all we're going to do on the water cycle. So, do you see where this might go on a quiz? You might have 2 questions about the water cycle. You really need to know that autotrophs put water back into the atmosphere through transpiration. That's vital. Okay, so as we talk about the carbon cycle, where do you think a lot of carbon is stored? Okay, stretching. Well, I'll tell you what. There is carbon stored in a variety of places in this picture. So can you identify every single place in this picture where carbon could be stored? Okay. Now, individual pieces. All right, so Tyler Conto, give me one. In the bunny. Yes, everybody forgets the bunny. Okay, so there's carbon stored in the bunny. You have heard yourselves called carbon-based life forms? Yeah. All of the muscles and cells in your body are made up of a lot of carbon. So there's a lot of carbon stored in that rabbit. Okay, Ben, what was yours? The tree. Trees are mostly carbon chains. Wood is a carbon substance. Okay, Jacob.
The grass.
The grass is largely made up of carbon. It's a living thing. Yes. The apple has got a bunch of carbon here. What else? Where's another place that carbon's stored? The coal is a big one. And the soil itself has got a lot of carbon in it. Now there's one thing that everybody's missing.
Cloud.
Well, the atmosphere in general. So not just the cloud, but up in the atmosphere, we've got a lot, and I'll sort of try to circle a chunk of sky. Let's see. Okay. Okay, it's clear that that's not just the cloud, it's, atmosphere in general. So what form is this stored in some of these different places? Let's talk about the atmosphere. Last one we named, what form is carbon stored in the atmosphere? Well, what gas? What compounds in the atmosphere store carbon? There are two big ones. Well, nitrogen's a whole different chemical. And you guys have had physical science, you've had some very basic chemistry. But remember that carbon is a specific kind of atom, and it can form compounds to join with other kinds of atoms. Carbon dioxide. So CO2 is the biggest reservoir of carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon monoxide is another one. It's a little bit less common, and there's one more. We didn't draw a cow in here, but I always like to reference CH4. That's methane. And methane is also what comes out of the business end of a cow. Cow farts. Cows fart methane. Landfills also outgas methane. So have any of you had the chance to drive past the landfill on 224 going out towards PA on the other side of Poland? Okay. They have vent stacks that come up out of the landfill itself because as things decay, as bunnies and apples and chunks of wood and pieces of newspaper decay in the landfill, one of the ways that their carbon is released is in the form of methane. And if that builds up in the landfill, it can explode. And that's a real mess. They have most landfills have methane vents. In a lot of places they burn it off. And what they were experimenting with at the one over near Poland was burning it off for energy, actually making electricity. So we've got atmospheric carbon stored, three big forms: CO, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, some methane. Let's talk about the grass and the tree. There's a concept that we had earlier in this chapter. All the stuff that the producers in an ecosystem make is called what? Biomass. Biomass is a form of carbon storage. So right here, we have biomass. Right here, we have biomass. And that biomass is, we said it's a form of energy storage. It's also a form of carbon storage. It's a way of storing matter and energy. And the matter that you're storing is largely carbon. Grass and wood and stems and leaves and flowers and all the parts of plants that they make, that they store, is largely carbon. We're not going to get into the chemical formulas for these things. Well, I can give you one. Oh, and this is also biomass, our apple. Now, one of the primary forms of carbon that we see in our apple, this is going to get real messy here, is, oops, I'll have to write it over here and move it. C6H12 O6. And that's a simple sugar molecule. That's glucose. And a lot of what's being stored in the grass and the apple, and some in the tree, not as much, is in this form of sugar. So we've taken the carbon atoms from these things, from the methane and the carbon dioxide, mostly from the carbon dioxide, and those plants have turned them into other chemical compounds. And they're storing that carbon. Now let me ask you about the carbon in the bunny. What do bunnies eat? The wabbit? Yeah, grass, clover, plantain, dandelions, alfalfa, that apple if it falls on the ground. The rabbit will eat all of that. And the rabbit will take that sugar, those sugars, and it will make them into other carbon compounds. It will make them into cells for its body. We're going to talk about cells later down the road. Have I called you guys fatty water bags yet?
No.
I would like this opportunity to tell you, with all the fondness in my heart, that you're all a bunch of fatty water bags. You all okay with that?
I
I'm going to explain it a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
So that would be good. Wait till I call you mutants. That'll be next unit. Oh, have I? Okay, yeah, you're all a bunch of mutants too. So am I. I'm a fatty water bag and a mutant myself. I think it's a nice club to belong
I
to.
don't think mutant is that offensive though.
Okay. Fatty water bags gets you a little bit more.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why you're all fatty water bags. Why I'm a fatty water bag. Why that rabbit is a fatty water bag. An earthworm is a fatty water bag. A fish is a fatty water bag. You're all a bunch of fatty water bags.
You drink water?
No.
That's not intentional,
So,
but
here's a cell in your body. You got them in every part of your body. Look at your hands. Go ahead, look at your hands. That skin, bunches of different kinds of cells. The muscles that underlie it, bunches of different kinds of cells. The blood coursing through your veins, little red blood cells, white blood cells. You know, you're just chock full of cells. Well, each of those cells has a boundary. It's got a membrane. And if we take a look at a piece of that membrane, what we would see is that it's actually a bunch of carbons stacked on top of one another. With a bunch of hydrogens and some phosphorus. It's called a phospholipid. A lipid is a fat. So your cell walls are all basically made up of fat. I'm not talking about your fat cells here. We all got them. No matter how skinny any of you are, you have fat cells. If you didn't, you would be dead. You have to store energy in the form of fat. No matter how skinny or how fat you are, every cell in your body is made up of fats. It's a special kind of fat. This is not Crisco. You're not made up of Crisco. It's a different kind of fat, but it is a type of fat molecule. It's a special type of fat molecule that makes up your cells. So basically what you have here is a bag, a container, and that container is made up of fat. It's a fatty bag. Guess what most of the stuff in that fatty bag is?
Water.
Water! Hence, you're all a bunch of fatty water bags. You're made up of tons and tons and tons of little tiny bags that contain water. No wonder you're so squishy. So, anyway, back to our bunny, who's also a fatty water bag. You don't need to copy this. We'll talk in much more depth about this when we do cells. But I wanted you to know why I was calling you fatty water bags before any of you got your feelings hurt or, said, my teacher called me a fatty water bag. It's okay. I am too. We're all fatty water bags. Okay, so that rabbit takes those carbons from the apple, from the grass it eats, and those carbons end up in those long carbon chains, those fats, making up its cells. It also takes some of those cells that have carbon, and rabbits do what rabbits do. I think at least one of you has rabbits at home. Under the rabbit cage looks a lot like that, little chocolate chips. So that's another form of I'll never eat chocolate chip cookies again. That's another place that carbon leaves the rabbit. So that rabbit is taking in carbon from the things it eats, and it's making them part of its body, as well as pooping them out. Well, now what happens? Let's see if I can manage this. Here, we'll try to get rid of some of these circles. Cut. All rabbits at some point in their lives.
They die.
Rabbits die. I raised rabbits. And eventually, dum dum da dum 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 dum, the bunny dies. So the bunny's now laying down dead. So that bunny had a bunch of carbon in it. Guess what happens to the tree eventually? I can't draw little Xy eyes on the tree, but the tree dies too. Guess what happens to the tree's leaves?
They fall.
They fall. The leaves die. I'll draw some little brown leaves. That's a terrible leaf. There, I don't know. Okay. They all hit the ground. Okay. So yeah, have a seat. It's biology. All those parts of those living things in that system die. They hit the ground. Where does their carbon go?
In the ground.
Yeah. Remember, we said here in the soil we had carbon. Guess what the carbon in the soil is mostly made up of? Dead rabbits, dead leaves, dead grass, dead stuff. Okay? And there are bacteria in the soil. What are the things that break dead things down into smaller pieces? Decomposers. So those decomposers break the dead bunny, the dead leaves, the dead apple, the dead tree, the dead grass into smaller and smaller chunks. Okay,
Until it
now,
disappeared.
no, the carbon never disappears.
Well,
Guess what those decomposers burp out?
or-
Those little decomposers, I'll draw a little bacteria down here. Let's make him yellow so he shows up. So there's a little decomposer bacteria. And that decomposer is eating the rabbit, the apples, the anything else. Decomposers burp out CO2. So when something is decomposing, the little bacteria that are breaking it up are in essence sitting there belching out CO2. So that's more CO2 back in the atmosphere. So basically, this rabbit or this tree or that apple stored carbon for a little bit of time, and when the thing that's storing the carbon dies, it gets released back into the atmosphere. So that's sort of a short-term carbon cycle. That doesn't take long. How long does a rabbit live in the wild? If you're a really unlucky rabbit, a couple months. If you're a really lucky rabbit, maybe a couple years. So maybe you get to hold on to some of that carbon for a few years. How long does a tree live?
Hundreds.
That could be a couple hundred years, yeah.
Thousands.
You know, very few trees live thousands of years. Some do, but most species don't. Most of the trees we have around here have a life, 200, 300, 400 years. You know, a 400-year-old tree around here is probably nearing the end of its natural life. Trees don't live forever, just like rabbits. So it stores that carbon for a while, but then it goes back into the atmosphere. What's another way that you could release the carbon from a tree? Hey, Zach, what was that question you had? About burning things. Combustion. Anybody here burn wood? Okay. Guess what you're doing when you're burning wood?
Using carbon.
You're releasing carbon. You're taking all of those chains of carbon, all of those sugars. Trees also have some fat in their cells. And you're putting it back into the air as CO and CO2. So your wood stove is releasing carbon from trees and from the junk mail that you stick in there and anything else. So this doesn't take very long. That turns over pretty quickly. How do you store carbon for a long time? So we've got this nice thick seam of coal down here. What's coal? Smushed, yeah, mostly plants, but trees also. So coal is actually just really old biomass. Okay? Coal is 10 million year old, 2 million year old, 3 million year old biomass. It is mostly the dead trees and grasses and plants, and really it's ferns and some other plants you never heard of because they were extinct 10 million years ago. But it's plants. They're compressed and they form coal. And animals tend to form what fossil fuel? It's actually mostly bacteria. Oil, the other fossil fuel we use a lot of. So when you burn coal or oil, what are you releasing?
Carbon.
Old carbon. Carbon that's being stored for a few million years. Okay? What we're going to look at tomorrow, you are going to have, can you pull that door shut? We're going to have a paper lab to do. The paper lab that you're going to do is going to look at the relationship of living things to the content of the atmosphere. And we're going to talk a little bit about how adding or subtracting living things from the mix changes the atmosphere. And that's going to then be all we're going to do about atmospheric gases and cycling. We'll do a brief little film on the nitrogen cycle, and then we will have some review and a quiz.
So that was like 2 days.